Professionals couldn't fix it. Take your toolbox and go home. The biker's voice cut through this garage like a blade. Every man in that compound was watching her, waiting for her to turn around, to flinch, to walk back to that rusted pickup truck and disappear the way she came. She didn't move. She looked straight at the covered motorcycle in the corner, the one they called the Widowmaker, and said 5 words so quietly the whole room went still. Then you've been fixing the wrong thing. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The old pickup truck had a crack running across the bottom of the windshield that Haley Monroe had been ignoring for 6 months. The driver's side window wouldn't roll all the way down. The tailgate was held shut with a bungee cord she'd bought at a gas station in Flagstaff and never replaced. The truck had about 230,000 miles on it, and it sounded like it resented every single one of them. But it ran. That was more than she could say about most things in her life at that particular moment. She was 24 years old, and she was pulling into Kingman, Arizona, with less than $200 in her wallet, a toolbox in the truck bed that was worth more than everything else she owned combined, and a plan so loose she wouldn't even call it a plan. More of a direction. Southish. Warm. Somewhere she could find work with her hands before the money ran out completely. She had been a mechanic since she was 16, not because anyone taught her in any formal way, but because she grew up in a succession of houses where things broke and nobody fixed them, and at some point she decided that if she wanted anything to work, she was going to have to figure it out herself. That turned out to be true about a lot of things. Cars, appliances, people. Mostly cars, though. She'd worked at a tire shop in Phoenix, a transmission place in Tucson, a small independent garage in Prescott, where the owner paid her under the table, and then closed down without warning one Friday afternoon. She'd done mobile repair work, roadside work, the kind of jobs where a stranger calls at 9 o'clock at night from the shoulder of a highway, and you show up because you need the money, and because something in you genuinely cannot leave a broken thing alone. She had never worked for anyone long enough to call it a career. She had never lived anywhere long enough to call it home. Kingman was just the next place. She pulled off the main road because she saw an old hand-painted sign that said, "Repairs," and figured it was worth stopping to ask if anyone needed extra hands. The place was a 2-bay roadside garage, the kind that still had a faded Dr. Pepper thermometer nailed to the exterior wall and a dog sleeping in the gravel out front. The man inside was named Earl. He was somewhere in his 60s, heavy, with the permanently oil-stained hands of someone who had been in this business for 40 years and wasn't going to change his habits now. He looked at her the way most garage owners looked at her, a long, appraising look that was half skepticism and half curiosity. And then he told her honestly that he didn't have enough work to take on another person. She thanked him and turned to go. "You might try over on Route 66, he said, like he was thinking out loud. "There's a place that's been looking. Well, not exactly a place. More of a situation." She turned back. "What kind of situation?" Earl leaned against his workbench and crossed his arms. "You know anything about the Hells Angels chapter out here?" She knew the name. Everybody knew the name. "Some," she said. "There's a compound about 20 minutes east. They've got a motorcycle been sitting in their garage for 17 years. Can't get it to run." He paused. "Well, it runs. That's the thing. It starts up fine. Then right around 17 seconds, something goes wrong. Terrible sound. Engine overheats. Everything shuts down. After that, nothing. They can't find what causes it." Haley tilted her head slightly. "What does the sound like?" "They say it's a scream, like metal tearing itself apart from the inside. But when they take it apart, nothing is physically wrong. Every component checks out. They've replaced half the engine over the years. Wiring, fuel system, the whole thing basically. Doesn't matter. 17 seconds. Every time, every single time, like clockwork." Earl shook his head slowly. "There's a reward. Has been for years. Somebody finally fixed a number. I don't know what it is, but word is, it's enough to make it worth the drive." Haley was quiet for a moment. Who owned the motorcycle? Fella named Frank Dalton. He was the mechanic for that chapter. Best wrench they ever had by all accounts. Built the thing himself mostly. Custom parts, years of work. He died before he ever got to ride it. She waited to see if Earl was going to add something. He seemed to be choosing his words. Most of the mechanics who went out there said the same thing afterward, that there's something about that bike that doesn't add up. Not mechanically. The numbers are fine. The components are fine. But something about the way it was put together. He shrugged. Most of them figured it was bad luck. Some kind of bad luck built into the machine itself. The members took to calling it the Widowmaker. Some of them just call it the cursed bike. Haley looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked back up. You said there's a reward. That's what I heard. She nodded once, slowly. How do I get there? The compound sat back from the highway behind a chain-link fence line, and the first thing she noticed when she rolled through the gate was the quiet. She had expected noise, engines, music, the sounds she associated with everything she'd ever seen or heard about a place like this. Instead, it was almost still. A few men moved around the property with the unhurried efficiency of people who had been doing the same things in the same place for a long time. There were motorcycles everywhere, parked in rows, leaning on kickstands, some in various states of disassembly, and everything had a coating of fine Arizona dust. She parked the truck and got out. She didn't announce herself. She just stood by her truck with her toolbox on the tailgate and waited. A man came over. He was big, not just tall but wide, the kind of physical presence that had a weight to it, even when the person was standing still. His beard had gone mostly gray, and he wore it long. He looked at her with dark, level eyes that gave nothing away. "You lost?" he said. "No," she said. "I heard you have a motorcycle that doesn't run." He studied her. "You heard that where?" "Garage on the main road. Man named Earl." He didn't react to the name either way. "We've had mechanics come out before," he said. "Professionals. People with credentials and equipment. Couldn't fix it." "I know," she said. "Earl told me." "So what makes you think you can do something they couldn't?" She didn't answer immediately. She took a breath. "Maybe nothing," she said. "Maybe they were right, and there's nothing to fix. But I'd like to look at it. If I can't figure it out in 48 hours, I'll leave, and you don't owe me anything." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her truck, then at the toolbox, then back at her face. "I'm Grizzly," he said. "I run this chapter." Haley Monroe. I didn't shake her hand, but he didn't turn her away either. He just turned and walked toward the main building, and she understood that meant she was supposed to follow. The garage was off the main structure, a separate building with wide rolling doors. A few men were already inside when Grizzly led her in, and more filtered in behind them, drawn by whatever word passes invisibly through a place like that when something interesting is happening. She registered the looks. She had spent her whole professional life registering those looks, the evaluative ones, the skeptical ones, the mildly hostile ones. She had long ago stopped taking them personally and started treating them as information. These particular looks said, "We have seen real mechanics fail at this, and we do not understand what you think you're going to accomplish." That was fine. She didn't need them to understand yet. Grizzly walked to the far end of the garage. A large motorcycle sat against the wall, covered by a black tarp that had a thick layer of dust on it, which told her it had been sitting undisturbed for a while. He reached over and pulled the tarp off in one practiced motion, and there it was. The motorcycle was extraordinary. She could see that immediately, even before she started examining it technically. It was a Harley platform, but almost nothing on it was stock. Custom frame, custom covers, machined components that had clearly been made specifically for this machine, not pulled from a catalog. It had the weight and presence of something that had taken years to build, and whoever built it had genuinely cared. Not just about performance or appearance, but about the object itself. The way it was put together said something about the person who built it. She stood very still and looked at it. Then she set down her toolbox and crouched down to look at the lower section of the frame. She didn't touch anything. Not yet. A voice from the back of the small crowd. You planning on doing anything, or just looking at it? She didn't turn around. I'm looking at it, she said. Another voice, closer. You want to hear what the others found? No, she said quietly. I'd rather not. She could feel the temperature of the room shift slightly. Not anger, but something between impatience and confusion. The previous mechanics had all come in with equipment, with checklists, with theories they'd formed before they even saw the machine. She was crouching on a concrete floor, looking at a motorcycle like it was a conversation she was trying to understand. She stayed low and moved slowly around the outside of the machine, examining the frame welds, the bracket placements, the routing of the electrical harness, the positioning of the oil lines. She touched the frame lightly in several places, feeling for temperature differentials in the metal, for vibrations she couldn't have named if someone asked her to, but that her hands had learned to read years ago. How long she been just sitting there? A man said from behind her. Not talking to her, talking to Grizzly. About 10 minutes, Grizzly said. Previous mechanics had their equipment out in 3 minutes. I know, Grizzly said. Silence. She continued moving it around the motorcycle, unhurried, and now she was on one knee on the far side, examining something near the lower crankcase. She leaned in close, reached for her flashlight, a small, very bright one she kept in her front shirt pocket, and aimed it at the area without touching anything yet. She saw something. She didn't say anything. She leaned back, looked at a different section of the frame, then came back to the same spot. She pulled a small notebook from her back pocket, an actual paper notebook, worn soft at the corners, and wrote something down. What are you writing? The closer voice said. Notes, she said. Notes about what? You haven't even started the engine. She looked up at that voice for the first time. The man it belonged to was maybe 40, with a trimmed dark beard and a look that was openly hostile. He wasn't trying to hide his skepticism. He was performing it. I'm not starting the engine, she said. Then what exactly? The previous mechanic started the engine, she said, and the engine ran for 17 seconds and then failed. They had the same result every time. Starting the engine is the part that isn't working, so I'm not going to start there. The man stared at her. That's the most backwards thing I've ever heard. Okay, she said, and went back to her notebook. She's wasting our time, the man said to Grizzly. Grizzly didn't respond. She registered that too. She spent the next 2 hours like that, examining, photographing with her phone, measuring, writing things down, touching the frame and the engine casings and the various custom components with the focused attention she normally reserved for the middle of a very difficult problem. She wasn't at the middle yet. She was still at the beginning, trying to understand what she was actually looking at. Because something was already bothering her. Not about the engine, about the motorcycle as a whole. There was a consistency to the way it was built. A logic, a sensibility, a kind of signature that she was beginning to recognize. But in a few specific places, that consistency broke down. Small things. A bolt head that didn't match the tool marks on the surrounding fasteners. A section of wiring harness routed slightly differently than the rest. A bracket mounted at an angle that didn't quite align with the design logic of everything around it. To someone running a diagnostic computer, these things would be invisible. They weren't malfunctions. They weren't damage. They were just inconsistencies. As if someone had opened this motorcycle up after it was built, and then tried to close it again without quite knowing how. She sat back on her heels, staring at the lower crankcase area. You said the mechanic who built this died before he wrote it, she said. Grizzly, still watching from a few feet away, said, That's right, Frank Dalton. How long before he wrote it? The bike was almost done when he died, maybe a few weeks out by our estimate. Who had access to it after he died? A pause. What kind of question is that? She turned and looked at Grizzly directly. Someone opened this engine after Frank Dalton built it, she said. I can see the marks. Different tool, different technique. The bolts around the lower crankcase show it clearly. The marks don't match the rest of the machine. The room went very quiet. What you're saying, Grizzly said slowly, is that someone tampered with it. I'm saying someone opened it. Whether that was tampering or an attempted repair or something else, I don't know yet. She looked at the motorcycle. But this machine didn't start failing on its own. Something changed after Frank built it. The man with the dark beard, she still didn't know his name, spoke from the back. That's a serious accusation. I haven't accused anyone of anything, she said. I just described what I'm looking at. You're implying someone in this chapter. I'm implying that someone with access to this garage, at some point in the last 17 years, opened this engine. That's all I'm implying. I don't know who. I don't know why. She looked at Grizzly again. I'm telling you because it changes what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for a mechanical defect. I'm looking for something that was deliberately added. Grizzly held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "Keep going." She worked through the afternoon and into the early evening without stopping, breaking only once to use the bathroom and once to eat half a granola bar she found in her jacket pocket. She was barely aware of the men moving in and out of the garage around her. They came and went, watching for a while, losing interest, drifting back. The man with the dark beard stayed. She noticed that. He didn't say anything else to her. He just stood with his arms crossed at the edge of the space, watching with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not interested exactly. More like watchful, like someone waiting for something specific. She had a name for him now. She'd heard someone else use it. Hawk. She filed that away and kept working. By the time the afternoon light was changing, she had mapped almost the entire motorcycle, not disassembled it, but documented every visible component and their relationships to each other. She had a fairly complete picture of how the machine had been designed to work. And that complete picture was what finally let her see the anomaly clearly. There was a section of the lower engine, behind a custom oil return housing, where the geometry of the components didn't quite add up. The housing was larger than it needed to be for its apparent function. There was space inside it that wasn't accounted for by anything she could see. She began removing the housing with careful, slow movements, setting each bolt in a precise row on a clean rag so she could put them back in order. When the housing came free, she leaned in with her flashlight. There was a second chamber behind it. A narrow, sealed space, completely invisible from outside. Visible even with the housing off, unless you were specifically looking for it because the geometry had told you something was wrong. And inside that chamber was a component she had never seen before on any motorcycle in any schematic she had ever studied. A tiny mechanical valve, precisely machined, connected to the oil pressure line on one side and an alternative routing on the other. She stared at it. Her mind worked through the mechanics automatically, the way her mind always worked through mechanical problems. Systematically, one implication at a time, following the logic wherever it went. The valve was spring-loaded and closed when there was no pressure. When the engine started cold, oil pressure would be low, and the valve would stay closed. Everything would function normally, but once the engine warmed up and oil pressure rose, after approximately 15 to 20 seconds of running, the valve would open and redirect lubrication away from the main bearing. In exactly 17 seconds, the engine would begin screaming. She sat back on the concrete floor of the garage. She understood now. The whole thing. The scream, the heat, the shutdown, the fact that nothing was ever wrong when the engine cooled because the valve would close again when pressure dropped. The fact that every component checked out because every component was fine. The fault wasn't structural. It was dynamic. It only existed at operating pressure, and it vanished the moment the engine stopped. No diagnostic computer in the world would have found this. No visual inspection of a cold, unpressurized engine would have found this. The only way to find it was to understand that the space for it existed before you knew what was in it. She had found it because she refused to start the engine first. She sat there for a moment, processing. Then she looked more closely at the valve. There was an engraving on it. Tiny letters, precise, machine engraved. She brought her flashlight closer. FD. Do not remove until the truth is found. She read it 3 times. Then she sat very still, in the quiet of the garage, with the smell of old oil and metal around her, and felt the entire shape of the problem shift underneath her. Frank Dalton didn't build a broken motorcycle. He built a lock. And somewhere inside this machine was whatever it was locking away. She didn't tell anyone what she'd found. Not yet. She replaced the housing, put away her tools, stretched her back, and told Grizzly she needed a few hours. He showed her a small room at the back of the main building. A cot, a single lamp, a bathroom down the hall. She thanked him and went in and sat on the edge of the cot. She thought about the inscription. F.D. Frank Dalton. Do not remove until the truth is found. What truth? She thought about a man who spent years building a motorcycle out of custom components, a machine designed to represent something beyond mechanics, something about brotherhood, about community, about the best version of what a group of people could be to each other. Then he died before he ever wrote it. And sometime after he died, someone opened that engine. And the motorcycle that was supposed to mean something spent 17 years sitting under a dusty black cover, screaming and dying every time anyone tried to start it. She lay back on the cot and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the valve, about the precision of it, not just technically, but strategically. Whoever designed it understood engines deeply. They knew exactly how long it would take for oil pressure to rise to the threshold. 17 seconds wasn't an accident. It was a calculation. Do not remove until the truth is found. What if the valve wasn't sabotage? What if it was a message? What if Frank Dalton built a machine that was designed to fail? Deliberately, specifically, in a way only a very patient and very observant mechanic would ever understand. Because he needed something to stay hidden until the right person came along? She sat up. If there was something hidden inside the motorcycle, something that couldn't come out until someone understood the machine well enough to look, then she hadn't finished finding it. She had found the lock. She hadn't found what it was protecting. She put her boots back on and went back to the garage. It was past midnight. The compound was quieter, but not silent. She could hear voices somewhere in the main building, the occasional sound of a bike running briefly outside before shutting down. She had the garage to herself, which was what she wanted. She didn't go back to the hidden chamber. She had already understood the valve. What she needed now was to understand the structure of the motorcycle from a different perspective, not as a machine, but as a container. If Frank Dalton had built something to hide documents, records, evidence, anything that needed to survive heat, vibration, oil exposure, years of storage, he would have needed a sealed, insulated space. He would have needed something structurally protected. He would have needed to think like an engineer building a vault, not like a mechanic building an engine. She thought about the frame. The frame of a custom motorcycle is hollow by nature. Tubes of steel, welded together, running the length of the machine. In a factory bike, that space was largely wasted. In a custom build, a careful builder could route wiring, run fuel lines, conceal components. With the right modifications, a section of frame could be made nearly pressure-tight. She began working on the frame systematically, tapping it with her knuckles in sections, listening for the difference between solid steel, empty tube, and something in between. Halfway along the main backbone, behind the fuel tank and above the engine, she heard it. The sound changed. Not hollow, not solid. Something else, a slightly different resonance, as if the tube were not entirely empty, but not entirely open either. She felt along the frame carefully and found a section where the paint had a slightly different texture. Not visibly different, but tactilely. There was a seam that wasn't a weld and wasn't a joint. It was a cap, fitted precisely and painted over to be invisible. She worked it loose with patience, with the right combination of tools, without forcing anything, because she was well aware that whatever was inside had survived 17 years, and she was not going to damage it now. The cap came free. Inside the hollow section of the frame was a stainless steel tube, sealed at both ends. Inside the tube, when she opened it, were papers, photographs, handwritten notes, old receipts, a small brass key, and at the very bottom of the tube, separated from the rest, a single sealed envelope. She brought everything to the workbench and laid it out carefully under the light. She started with the photographs. Several were group shots. Men on motorcycles, men at events, the kind of photographs that documented years of shared history. She didn't recognize any of the faces. Then she found one that made her stop. It was a smaller photograph, older than the others, with a white border and slightly faded color that put it in the early 2000s. A man and a woman stood together, the woman holding a small child, a toddler, maybe 2 years old, with wispy blonde hair that caught the light. The man was smiling, not the posed smile of someone aware of the camera, but the unguarded smile of someone who didn't know the moment was going to matter. Haley turned the photograph over. On the back, in careful handwriting, Emily and little Haley, the family I never got the courage to return to. The garage was absolutely silent. She stood at the workbench with the photograph in her hand and felt something shift in her chest. Not a sudden crash of emotion, but something slower and stranger, like a foundation moving. Like the ground you thought was solid, turning out to be something else entirely. Her mother's name was Emily. She had been a toddler with wispy blonde hair. She had spent her entire life being told her father had simply left. She set the photograph down very carefully on the workbench. Then she picked up the handwritten notes and began reading. And the story they told was bigger and darker and more complicated than any mechanical problem she had ever taken apart. Frank Dalton hadn't just built a motorcycle. He had been a keeper of records. He had discovered that someone was systematically stealing from a charity fund managed through the chapter. Money intended for injured riders, for widows, for families who had nowhere else to turn, and that the theft had been going on for years. He had tried to find proof. He had tried to understand the full picture before he said anything, because he knew that an accusation without evidence would tear the community apart and destroy the reputation of whoever was accused, whether they were guilty or not. He had found the evidence, the receipts, the financial records, the documentation of how the money moved. It was all here, in this tube, in this motorcycle. But he had hidden it. Not because he was afraid, because someone close to him, someone with access, someone trusted, had already been accused. And that person was innocent, and Frank had known it, and before he could prove it, he had died. She stood at the workbench with her father's papers spread out before her, and she understood now that the motorcycle wasn't cursed. It was waiting. It had been waiting for 17 years, for someone patient enough to listen before they started the engine, for someone who thought like Frank Dalton, for someone who was, in ways she was only beginning to understand, Frank Dalton's daughter. She put the photograph in her shirt pocket. She left everything else on the workbench. She was going to fix this motorcycle, not because of the reward, not because of Frank Dalton's name, because she was a mechanic, and there was a broken machine in front of her, and she had never in her life walked away from a broken thing that could be fixed. She picked up her tools, and she went back to work. She was deep inside the engine bay, her forearms dark with grease, and her mind completely absorbed in the careful extraction of the hidden valve. She wanted to remove it cleanly, study its construction, understand the full precision of what Frank had designed, when she heard the sound. Metal on concrete. Small, sharp, clear. She went completely still. The sound had come from the far side of the garage, near the rolling doors. She stayed where she was, crouched beside the motorcycle, and listened. Footsteps. Careful ones. Then silence. Then the distinct sound of someone moving very deliberately, very quietly, toward the motorcycle. She didn't announce herself. She didn't move. She controlled her breathing and waited. A shadow crossed the single working light in the garage. Then she heard the specific metallic sound of someone cutting through a cable. A clean, deliberate cut. The kind you make with purpose, not the kind you make by accident. She was on her feet before she fully decided to stand up. Hey! The shadow was already moving. By the time she cleared the side of the motorcycle, it was gone, through the side door, which swung shut behind it with a sound she would remember. She stood in the middle of the garage, alone, her heart hammering. On the floor beside the motorcycle lay a section of electrical cable, cut clean through. She crouched down and looked at it without touching it. Then she looked at the side door. Then she stood up straight and took a slow breath. Someone in this compound did not want this motorcycle to run. And now she knew that for certain, instead of just suspecting it. She wrapped the cut cable carefully in a clean rag, labeled it with a piece of tape and her pen, and set it on the workbench beside her father's papers. Then she went and found Grizzly. Whatever happened next, she was not going to pretend she hadn't seen what she saw. Some things you had to say out loud, even when every instinct told you to be careful. Frank Dalton had apparently learned that lesson too late. She wasn't planning to make the same mistake. Grizzly opened the door before she knocked. She didn't know if he'd been awake, or if some instinct built over decades of running a compound had told him something was wrong. Either way, he was standing in the doorway in the same clothes he'd been wearing all day, and he looked at her face and said nothing. He just stepped back and let her in. She set the cut cable on the table in front of him. He looked at it. He didn't touch it. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he recognizes but wasn't expecting to see. "Someone came into the garage about 40 minutes ago," she said. "I was working on the engine. I heard them. By the time I got up, they were gone. This was on the floor." Grizzly picked up the cable and turned it slowly in his hands. "Clean cut," he said. "Yes." "Not an accident." "No." He set it back down. He pulled out a chair and sat heavily, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man carrying a weight he'd been carrying for a very long time. He rubbed his face with both hands. "You find anything else today, before this happened?" She'd been thinking about this on the walk over. How much to say? What order to say it in? She'd decided on the walk that she was going to tell him the truth, all of it. But not tonight. Tonight she needed him focused on the compound, on the present problem, not on 17-year-old documents and revelations that were going to change everything he thought he knew. "I found evidence that someone modified the engine after Frank built it," she said. "A component that was designed to cause the failure. That's what I was working on when whoever that was came through the door." Grizzly was very still. "You're telling me the bike was never cursed?" "No, it was never cursed. It was tampered with, after Frank died. Someone who had access to this garage opened the engine and added something that guaranteed it would never run past 17 seconds. She paused. "I can fix it. I can remove the component and rebuild around it. But I need to know the garage is secure while I work." Grizzly looked at the cable for another long moment. Then he stood up. "Nobody goes in or out of that garage without me knowing about it," he said. "Starting now." He picked up his phone and made 2 calls, short and direct. The calls of a man who didn't need to explain himself to the people he was calling. When he was done, he looked at her. "Who knows what you found?" "Just you. Keep it that way, for now." She nodded. She went back to the garage, and this time there were 2 men stationed outside it. She went back to work. The first thing she did when she got back to the workbench was look at the cut cable and figure out exactly what it controlled. It took her about 6 minutes. It was part of the ignition circuit, not the main line, but a secondary redundancy that modern diagnostics would flag as a fault, and that would prevent a clean start. Without it, the motorcycle would attempt to start and immediately fail. Anyone testing it the next day would conclude she'd made things worse, not better. Whoever cut it knew the electrical system of this motorcycle intimately. That wasn't a casual act of vandalism. That was surgical. She photographed the cable, documented the cut, then set it aside and went back to the main work. She could splice it. That wasn't the hard part. The hard part, the part she was still working through, was the hidden valve, and specifically how to remove it without disturbing the sealed compartment she'd already found in the frame. The sealed compartment with her father's papers inside. She hadn't processed that yet. She couldn't afford to. She had learned a long time ago, in a series of difficult circumstances that she never talked about, that some things had to wait. Grief waited, shock waited, discovery waited. You could feel all of it later, deeply and fully, but right now there was work, and the work was all that mattered. She focused on the valve. The more she studied its construction, the more impressed she was, and the more disturbed. This was not something that an amateur had machined. The tolerances were exact, the spring calibration precise, the integration with the oil pressure system seamless. Whoever built it had Frank Dalton's level of skill. Maybe better. She wrote that down in her notebook. Then she began the careful, slow process of removing it. It took 4 hours. Not because it was difficult to access. She already had the housing off. But because she needed to do it in a way that left the surrounding components completely undamaged. She needed to remove a piece that had been deliberately hidden and then be able to show it to Grizzly and to the chapter as physical evidence of what had been done to this machine. It needed to be intact. It needed to be legible. By the time she had it free, it was nearly 4 in the morning, and her hands were shaking slightly from the sustained fine work. She set the valve under the brightest light on the workbench and photographed it from every angle. Then she read the inscription again. FD. Do not remove until the truth is found. She wrapped it carefully in a clean cloth and set it with the cut cable. Then she looked at the hole it had left in the oil circuit. Now came the real mechanical work. The valve had been integrated into a custom section of the oil return housing. Not simply inserted, but machined in as if it had always been part of the design. To remove it cleanly meant rebuilding that section of the housing. She didn't have the machine shop equipment to fabricate from scratch, but she didn't need to. She had the original design logic of the motorcycle. She'd spent hours mapping it, and she could see what the housing was supposed to look like before the valve was added. She could rebuild it back to Frank's original intent using the components she had available, adapting where she needed to. She started laying out parts. She didn't hear Hawk come in. She didn't know he was there until she reached for a tool and looked up and found him standing 10 feet away, watching her work. She was surprised but didn't show it. She looked at him steadily. Grizzly said nobody in the garage without his clearance, she said. Grizzly's the one who sent me, Hawk said. Wanted someone watching. That might have been true. She decided to let it go. You've been working all night, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. What did you find? I'm still finding it. He moved a step closer, looking at the workbench. His eyes went to the cloth-wrapped valve, to the cut cable in its labeled rag, to the photographs she'd spread out earlier and then set face down when she'd gone to find Grizzly. She noticed his eyes go specifically to the face-down photographs. You're not going to start the engine, he said. Not tonight. When? When it's ready. Previous mechanics all said it would be ready within 12 hours. Previous mechanics were wrong. She picked up the tool she'd been reaching for and went back to work. 17 years of wrong. I'm not going to rush the part that actually matters. He was quiet for a while. She worked. She could feel him watching. Not the general watching of a curious observer, but something more focused. Something that had a specific object she couldn't quite identify. You know anything about the history of this bike? He said finally. Some, she said. I know Frank Dalton built it. You know anything else about Frank? She kept her hands moving. Not much, she said. Why? A pause. No reason, he said. He left before she could respond to that, which told her something too. People who left right after saying something was no reason always had a reason. She added Hawk to the list of things she needed to think about. Then she went back to the oil housing. By the time the morning light started coming under the garage doors, she had the housing rebuilt. She double-checked every connection, every line, every junction point 3 times. She was not going to let this fail, because she'd been in a hurry at 6 in the morning after a sleepless night. She then moved to the electrical system. The cut cable took about 30 minutes to splice properly. Clean joins, proper insulation, no improvised shortcuts. She did it the way she did everything, right the first time, so she wouldn't have to do it twice. Then she sat back and looked at the whole motorcycle. The valve was gone. The housing was rebuilt. The electrical system was repaired. Every component she could access and check, she had checked. The motorcycle should run. But she wasn't going to start it yet. Not because it wasn't ready mechanically. It was. Because she had not yet told Grizzly everything she found. She had not yet shown him the papers, the photographs, the financial records that Frank Dalton had hidden inside the frame. And she understood, in a way that went beyond strategy, that was almost intuition, that the motorcycle running and the truth in those documents needed to come out together. One without the other would be incomplete. Frank had designed it that way. The machine fails until someone understands it. The truth stays hidden until someone is patient enough to look. She was patient. But she also needed to understand what she was about to hand to these people. She took out the papers from the frame tube again. She'd put them in her jacket pocket, keeping them with her, and spread them on the workbench under the light. She started with the financial records. They were meticulous. Dates, amounts, transaction descriptions, account numbers, vendor names. Frank had been documenting this for at least 2 years before he died, which meant he'd been watching something unfold slowly and gathering evidence with the patience of a man who understood that the first accusation had to be the last one. He couldn't afford to be wrong. The picture the records painted was clear. Someone had been systematically siphoning money from a motorcycle charity fund, a fund that paid for medical care for riders hurt on the road, for funeral expenses when a member died without family support, for tools and equipment for young members just getting started. The amounts weren't enormous individually, but over time, they added up to tens of thousands of dollars. The method was sophisticated. Altered invoices from vendors, duplicate billing, fictitious service charges run through a third-party account. The kind of thing that looked legitimate from a distance, but, when you tracked it carefully, formed a pattern that was unmistakable. Someone with real accounting knowledge had designed this. And at the center of the paper trail, over and over, was a name that appeared on authorization signatures. Caleb Brennan. She didn't know that name. She wrote it in her notebook. She kept reading. And then she found the section of Frank's notes that changed everything. In careful, cramped handwriting, Frank had written a summary of his findings. The money was real. The pattern was real. But the deeper he dug, the more a different picture emerged. The authorization signatures under Caleb Brennan's name were real, but the documents they authorized were not. The invoices were fabricated. The vendor accounts were shell accounts controlled by someone else. Caleb Brennan had signed documents he'd been given by someone he trusted, not knowing what those documents actually were. Caleb Brennan hadn't stolen anything. He'd been used. And then, when the money disappeared and someone started asking questions, he'd been the one holding the paper with his name on it. Frank wrote, "I did not speak up in time. I was still gathering proof. By the time I understood the full picture, Caleb was already gone. I carry that. This is how I try to set it right." Haley set the paper down. She stared at the workbench for a long time. Then she picked up the sealed envelope, the one at the bottom of the tube, the one with her name on it, her name. Haley. Not Monroe, just Haley. Which meant he didn't know her last name. He'd known she existed, known her first name, and that was all he'd had. Her hands weren't entirely steady when she opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten. The handwriting increasingly difficult to read toward the end, as if his hand had been shaking, or the pen had been running out. She read it slowly, reading some sections twice, making sure she understood what she was reading. He wrote about meeting her mother, about the years they'd spent together before Haley was born, about the life he'd been living at the time. A life he described with honest, unflinching clarity, not making excuses, just accounting for what it was. He wrote about making the decision to leave, believing that staying would eventually hurt them worse than leaving. He wrote that he knew, even as he made that decision, that it was the wrong one, that he was afraid, and that he dressed his fear up as protection and walked away from the only people he had ever loved. He wrote, "I was a coward dressed up as a man who was doing the right thing. I know the difference now. I didn't know it then." He wrote about searching for them. Years later, when the life he'd been living had changed enough that he thought he could offer something real. He found out Emily was gone. He found that Haley had been moved from place to place, that the trail went cold in a way that trails go cold when a child falls through the cracks of a system that was already overwhelmed. He never found her. So he built the one thing he could build. He wrote, "If you are reading this, you are a mechanic. You had to be, to find it. You had to be patient and careful, and you had to think about a broken thing differently than everyone else who tried to fix it. I don't know if that's because of me. I don't know if any of that is mine to claim, but I hope it is. I hope something of me found its way to you, even without me there to give it." He wrote, "I am sorry. There is more to say, but sorry is where it starts, and you should know I mean it without condition or expectation. You don't owe me anything. You never did. Whatever you do with these papers, whatever you decide about the truth, I hid inside this machine. That is yours, not mine. I am the one who ran out of time. You are the one who found it." The letter ended there. She sat with it for a long time. The garage was quiet. Outside, she could hear the compound beginning to wake up. Distant voices, a door closing, the sound of a motorcycle engine somewhere far across the property being tested briefly and then shut down. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. She was not going to cry in this garage. That was a decision she made with the same practical directness she made most of her decisions. Not because crying would be wrong. She understood it wouldn't be wrong. But because there was still work to do, and she needed to be clear-headed for it. She had the mechanical part handled. Now she had to figure out the human part. She was still working through that problem. Sitting on an upturned crate with the letter in her lap and her father's papers spread across the workbench, when the side door opened and Hawk walked back in. He stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him. In that moment, looking at his face, something clicked. Not gradually, not as a slow realization, but all at once, the way the right mechanical answer sometimes appeared, suddenly and completely, as if it had been there all along waiting for her to stop looking in the wrong place. Hawk. Caleb Brennan. 17 years. "Who was Caleb Brennan to you?" she said. The question hit him like something physical. She watched it happen, watched the careful composure he'd been wearing since she met him crack, just slightly, in a way that confirmed what she already suspected. His jaw tightened. "Where did you hear that name?" "Answer my question first," she said. A long silence. "He was my brother," Hawk said. She had known he was going to say that. She had known it from the moment the two pieces connected. But hearing it said out loud still changed the air in the room. "What happened to him?" she said. She asked it quietly, not as an interrogation, but as a genuine question, because she needed to understand the human dimension of what Frank's papers were going to mean when she put them on the table. Hawk looked at the floor. His arms were crossed, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. "I was accused of stealing from the charity fund," he said. "About 17 years ago. He denied it. Nobody believed him. He got pushed out, lost his marriage, moved away." He paused. "He died 4 years later. Heart attack. He was 41 years old." The room was very quiet. "And you blamed Frank Dalton," she said. Hawk's head came up sharply. "What do you know about it?" "I'm starting to know quite a bit," she said. She picked up Frank's summary pages, the ones laying out Caleb's innocence, the shell accounts, the fabricated invoices, and held them out. Hawk didn't move for a moment. Then he crossed the garage and took them from her hand. He read standing up, his eyes moving fast across the handwriting, and she watched his face and said nothing. She had learned, from years of delivering difficult news about the mechanical condition of vehicles people loved or depended on, that sometimes the most important thing you could offer was silence. Not comfort, not explanation, not the immediate rush to make someone feel better. Just space for the truth to land. Hawk read. His breathing changed. He reached the end of the summary and looked up. His eyes were red. "I was innocent," he said. The words came out rough, stripped down to almost nothing. "Yes," she said. "Frank knew it before he died. He was still gathering the complete evidence. He hid it in the motorcycle because he needed it to stay safe until someone could bring it out properly." Hawk looked down at the papers in his hands. 17 years, he said. "Yes. Caleb spent the last 4 years of his life." He stopped. He put one hand over his mouth briefly. He never stopped saying he didn't do it. Nobody listened. "Frank listened," she said. "He just ran out of time." A silence stretched between them, long and not entirely comfortable and necessary. Then something shifted in Hawk's expression. The grief moved, and underneath it was something else. Something older and harder that had been living in him a long time. "I spent 17 years hating Frank Dalton," he said. It came out flat, almost stunned. "I hated this bike. I hated everything it stood for. Every time someone talked about fixing it, about keeping it running, about what it meant to the chapter, I hated it." His voice dropped. "I wanted it gone. I wanted it taken apart so there was nothing left." Haley looked at him carefully. "Last night," she said. He didn't look away. "It was you," she said. The silence lasted exactly long enough to be an answer. "I just wanted it to stay broken," he said. "I wasn't going to hurt you. I just wanted to make sure it couldn't run. So the whole thing would be over. So we could all stop pretending that motorcycle meant something beautiful." His voice cracked slightly. "Because to me it was never beautiful. To me it was the machine that killed my brother." She took a breath. "Hawk," she said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully right now." He looked at her. "You cut that cable because you were in pain," she said. "I understand that. I understand what it feels like to need something to be over so badly that you stop thinking about who else gets caught in what you do. I understand that." She paused. "But that pain is Frank Dalton's papers all over again. The wrong person taking the damage while the real problem goes unaddressed." He flinched. "The real problem," she continued, "is that Caleb Brennan was innocent, and nobody knew it, and now you're the one with the proof in your hands. And what you do with that matters. It matters to Caleb's memory. It matters to the people who loved him. And it matters to whatever is left of your own integrity when this is over." Hawk looked at the papers for a long time. His hands weren't steady either. "What are you going to do?" he said. "I'm going to fix this motorcycle," she said. "And then I'm going to put everything Frank hid on that table in front of Grizzly and every member of this chapter. All of it." She looked at him steadily. "What you do between now and then is up to you." He understood what she was offering. The chance to step forward himself, instead of being exposed. The difference between a man who faced what he did and a man who waited to be caught. It was not a small thing to offer. I knew it, and she knew it. He nodded once, slowly. Then he handed the papers back to her, and he walked out of the garage. She watched him go. Then she turned back to the motorcycle. She picked up her tools. She had promised Grizzly she would tell him when someone tried to sabotage the repair, and she intended to keep that promise. But she was going to give Hawk the time he needed to do the right thing first. 1 hour. She gave herself 1 hour to finish the final checks on the engine before she went to Grizzly. She was 11 minutes into those checks when she heard Hawk's voice outside the garage. Not raised, not performing anything, just steady and tired and honest, asking the guard outside where Grizzly was. She set down her tools. She sat on the upturned crate. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Kingman with $200 and a bungee cord tailgate, she allowed herself 30 seconds to feel exactly what she was feeling. It wasn't simple. It was grief and anger, and something that might eventually become relief, threaded through with the strange, disorienting awareness that she was sitting in a garage built by her father, with her father's letter in her jacket pocket, about to start the engine of the machine he'd spent 8 years building and then designed to wait, specifically, stubbornly, impossibly, for someone like her. 30 seconds. Then she picked her tools back up. The engine wasn't going to check itself, and whatever was about to happen outside this garage, the motorcycle needed to be ready for it. She bent back over the engine, and her hands were steady, and the work was good. And somewhere in the compound, she heard Grizzly's voice say something sharp and then go quiet, and she understood that everything was about to change. She kept working, because the machine wasn't done yet, and neither was she. Grizzly came into the garage alone. That told her something. When a man who runs a compound full of people comes to a difficult conversation by himself, he's already made a decision about how he wants it to go. He doesn't want witnesses yet. He doesn't want the pressure of an audience shaping what gets said. He closed the door behind him. He looked at Hawk's empty spot near the wall, then at Haley, then at the workbench where Frank's papers were laid out in careful order. "He told me," Grizzly said. I know, she said. I heard him asking where you were. He said he cut the cable. Grizzly's voice was flat. Not angry. Something past anger. Something that had burned down to a hard, even residue. He said he'd been trying to prevent this repair for a while, not just last night. How long? 2 other mechanics before you. He found ways to discourage them before they even got started. Made sure word got out that the bike was bad luck, that anyone who touched it ended up worse off. He paused. I didn't know. I want you to understand that. I didn't know. I believe you, she said. He walked to the workbench. He looked at the papers without touching them. He also told me there was something in those documents about his brother, Grizzly said. He wouldn't tell me what. He said that was yours to show me. She looked at Grizzly for a moment. She was reading him the way she read mechanical problems, looking for the underlying structure, the thing that would tell her how much stress the system could take before something broke. How as a man who had been running a community for a long time, a man who understood that the truth was sometimes more expensive than the lie, but who had spent enough years watching the bill come due on old lies to know which one cost more in the end. She picked up the financial records. She handed them to him and let him read. He read slowly. He read everything. The documentation, the transaction records, the vendor accounts. He read Frank's handwritten summary twice. She watched his face, and she thought about what it meant to be the person in charge when something like this came to light. The particular kind of responsibility that came with leadership. Not just the authority, but the weight of everything that happened on your watch, including the things you didn't know about. He set the papers down. Caleb Brennan, he said. Yes. He was pushed out of this chapter. I was here for that. I was younger. I wasn't running things yet, but I was here. His jaw worked. He said he didn't do it. We didn't believe him. Frank believed him, she said. He found the proof. He just didn't find it in time. Who actually did it? She picked up the other section of the records. The ones tracking the shell accounts, the outside accountant, the fabricated invoices. She handed those over too. He read them. When he looked up, his face had gone very still. An outside accountant, he said. Someone with access to the fund records and the technical knowledge to make altered invoices look legitimate. They used Caleb's authorization credentials because Caleb was the one signing off on vendor payments. He never knew the documents were fake. This person is named in here? Account trails, not a direct name. But the financial forensics are complete enough that someone who knows what they're doing could follow it to a conclusion. She paused. Frank was building toward that. He ran out of time. Grizzly put both hands flat on the workbench. He stood there like that for a moment, leaning on them, looking at the papers. Caleb Brennan died thinking this chapter believed he was a thief, he said. Yes. And his brother spent 17 years hating Frank Dalton for it. Yes. And Frank was the one person who actually knew the truth. He shook his head slowly. He hid it in the motorcycle. He hid it because he wasn't finished yet. He needed the complete evidence before he could accuse anyone. He knew a partial accusation would destroy someone else the same way the original accusation destroyed Caleb. He was careful, maybe too careful, but he was trying to do it right. Grizzly straightened up. And then he died. And then he died, she said. The room sat with that for a moment. Then Grizzly said, You said there's more. She had been deciding how to handle this since 4 in the morning, whether to lead with it or follow with it, whether to separate it from the rest of the story or let it emerge as part of the whole. She reached into her jacket pocket. She put the photograph on the workbench. The one of Frank and Emily and the small blonde toddler. Grizzly looked at it. He didn't react right away. He just looked at it with the careful attention of a man who understood he was looking at something important and wasn't going to rush the moment. Frank had a family, she said. A woman named Emily and a daughter. He left them because he thought his life would hurt them. He spent years regretting it. By the time he tried to find them, Emily was gone. The daughter had been moved around through the system, and he couldn't trace her. Grizzly turned the photograph over. He read the inscription. He read it again. He looked up at her. She watched it happen on his face, The slow building comprehension, the way the pieces assembled themselves in his expression one by one until the picture was complete. "Emily and little Haley," he said. "Yes." His voice dropped. "Monroe. My mother's name was Emily Monroe," she said. "She died when I was 7. After that, I went through about a dozen different homes until I was old enough to take care of myself." She kept her voice level. She was not going to let it shake. "I grew up believing my father had abandoned us. I didn't know his name. I didn't know anything about him except that he left." Grizzly said nothing. "I didn't come here knowing any of this," she said. "I came here because Earl told me there was a broken motorcycle and a reward, and I needed work. I didn't know who Frank Dalton was. I didn't know what I was going to find inside that frame." She looked at the motorcycle. "But I found it. And now I know." Grizzly picked up the photograph and held it for a long moment. "You fixed his motorcycle," he said. "I fixed it because it was broken, and I'm a mechanic," she said. "Not because of who built it. I need you to understand that." "I do understand it," he said quietly. "But that doesn't make it less true that you fixed your father's motorcycle." She had no answer for that, because he was right. He set the photograph down gently. Then he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between grief and recognition and a kind of profound, settling respect. "There's a letter too," she said, "addressed to me. I'm keeping that." She paused. "The financial records are yours. The story of what happened to Caleb is yours to tell to your chapter. The truth is yours to deal with however you decide to deal with it. I'm not making demands about any of that." She looked at him steadily. "But I need this chapter to understand that the motorcycle being fixed is not separate from the truth coming out. Frank designed it that way deliberately. The machine doesn't run until someone understands it well enough to look. That's what he built. So when I start that engine, both things happen. The machine comes back, and the truth comes out. Together." Grizzly held her gaze for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "Assemble the chapter," she said. "Everyone, and bring Hawk." He looked slightly surprised at that last part. "Hawk," he repeated. "He has something to say," she said. "Let him say it." Grizzly studied her for a moment. "He cut the cable. He interfered with the repair. He tried to keep this motorcycle broken for 17 years. I know what he did," she said. "I also know why he did it. Those aren't the same conversation." She picked up her tools. "Give me 2 hours to finish the final checks, then bring everyone in." He nodded. He walked to the door, and then stopped. "Haley," he said. She looked up. "I'm sorry about your mother," he said. "And I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man. He was a genuinely good man who made some bad choices and spent a long time trying to make them right." His voice was rough. He talked about his daughter. Not often. He didn't say much. But sometimes, when he'd been working late on a build, he'd get quiet and say he hoped she was okay, wherever she was. He paused. "We never knew what that meant. Now we do." He left. She stood in the empty garage for exactly 5 seconds. Then she turned back to the motorcycle, and she worked harder and faster than she had worked at any point in the last 36 hours, because the engine needed to be perfect, and she had 2 hours, and she was Frank Dalton's daughter, and she did not leave things half done. She checked the rebuilt oil housing 3 more times. She traced every line in the electrical system from the repaired splice outward, looking for anything that might create a fault under load. She checked the fuel system, the ignition timing, the primary chain tension. She went through every component she could access systematically, and she did it with the focused ferocity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake, not just mechanically, but in every other way a thing could matter. At one point, her hands were shaking slightly, not from fatigue, though she was exhausted, but from something she couldn't entirely suppress. She stopped, pressed both palms flat on the workbench for 10 seconds, breathed deliberately, and then kept going. The engine was ready. She was ready. She cleaned up the workbench, organized the tools, and set Frank's papers, the financial records, the photographs, everything except the letter, in a careful, ordered stack. She set the hidden valve beside them in its cloth wrapping. She set the cut cable beside that. Then she walked to the main building to wash her hands and knuckles, despite the scrubbing, dark circles under her eyes, her blonde hair pulled back and escaping everywhere. And she thought about a man who had stood in garages like this one for 30 years, building things with his hands, trying to make something that would last. She dried her hands. She went back to the garage, and the chapter was there. All of them. More people than she expected. The compound had a larger membership than she'd registered during her time working. They filled the garage and spilled out through the door. The motorcycle sat in the center, uncovered, and the overhead lights were on, and the room had the particular quality of a place where people understood something significant was about to happen, but didn't know exactly what. Grizzly stood at the front. Hawk stood near the back wall. He was not looking at the motorcycle. He was looking at the floor, and the set of his shoulders told her everything about the weight he was carrying right now. She walked to the workbench. The room went quiet without her asking it to. She picked up the cloth-wrapped valve. She unwrapped it slowly and held it up. Most of you have seen mechanics come in here with equipment and expertise and walk away empty-handed, she said. Her voice was steady. I want to explain why they failed, because it matters, not just for this motorcycle, but for what I'm about to tell you. She held the valve up so the room could see it clearly. This is why the motorcycle screamed. This is why it died at 17 seconds. This is why every component checked out when mechanics took it apart. Because this component was hidden in a sealed chamber behind the oil return housing, and it was invisible to any diagnostic approach that started with running the engine. She paused. It's a pressure-activated valve. When the engine is cold and oil pressure is low, it stays closed and everything runs normally. When oil pressure rises, at approximately 17 seconds, the valve opens and redirects lubrication away from the main bearing. The engine overheats and shuts down. When it cools, pressure drops, the valve closes, and every component looks fine. The room was completely silent. It was designed this way, she said, deliberately, precisely, by someone who understood this engine better than anyone else who ever worked on it. She set the valve down. By Frank Dalton. The silence broke into murmurs, not loud, but present, a current of reaction moving through the room. She waited for it to settle. Frank didn't build a broken motorcycle, she said. He built a lock, and the reason he built a lock was because he needed to hide something inside this machine that he couldn't trust to any other method. Something that needed to survive years of storage, heat, vibration, and repeated attempts to dismantle the bike. Something that needed to stay safe until someone patient enough and skilled enough actually understood the machine before they tried to run it. She picked up the financial records. She held them so the room could see, not so anyone could read them from a distance, but so everyone understood she was holding real documents, paper evidence, the physical weight of something that had been waiting 17 years to be in this room. Frank discovered that someone was stealing from the chapter charity fund, she said. Thousands of dollars over several years intended for injured riders, for families who'd lost someone, for young members who needed help getting started. He documented everything. Transaction records, altered invoices, shell accounts. She paused. And he discovered something else. The man who was accused of that theft, Caleb Brennan, was innocent. Caleb's authorization credentials were used to cover the transactions, but the documents he signed were fabricated. He never knew what he was signing. The room was very, very quiet now. She watched faces. She was looking for specific reactions, not out of suspicion, but because she understood that a room full of people hearing a truth they'd believed was settled could respond in a dozen different ways, and she needed to read where the room was going before it went there. What she saw, mostly, was shock, and then, in a few faces, the ones who had been here long enough, something slower and more complicated. The dawning of a specific kind of horror that came from realizing you had watched an innocent man pay for something he didn't do. A voice from the middle of the room. Who did steal it? Frank's records traced the money to an outside accountant with access to the fund management system. The financial forensics are detailed enough to pursue. That's a conversation for after this one. And Frank knew Caleb was innocent. Yes, He was still gathering the complete evidence when he died. He didn't feel he could accuse anyone directly without a full picture, because he'd seen what a partial accusation had already done to Caleb. He was trying to do it right. Another voice, older, from near the back. He hid all of this in the motorcycle. Yes. For 17 years. Yes. Because he trusted that someone would eventually find it. She took a breath. He trusted that the right person would eventually find it. Someone who thought the way he thought. Someone who would look at a broken thing and ask the right question instead of the obvious one. She picked up the small photograph. She held it up. He also left this. The room looked at the photograph from a distance, most of them too far to see it clearly. Frank Dalton had a daughter, she said. He left her and her mother when his daughter was very young. He spent the rest of his life regretting it. He tried to find them, and he couldn't. She held the photograph steady. My name is Haley Monroe. My mother's name was Emily. I arrived in Kingman 3 days ago with less than $200 and a toolbox, looking for work. Her voice didn't break. She had decided it wasn't going to break, and it wasn't. I didn't know who built this motorcycle when I agreed to look at it. I didn't know what I would find inside it. And I am telling you now, in front of all of you, that I repaired this engine because I am a mechanic and it was broken, not because of whose daughter I am. My name is on the work, not his. The room was absolutely silent for a long moment. Then a sound she hadn't expected. Not applause, not cheering, but something more human than either of those. The sound of a room full of people absorbing something real and not knowing how to hold it, and holding it anyway. Grizzly's voice from the front. Hawk. Everyone turned. Hawk was still near the back wall. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 2 days. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just decided to put it down, and his body was still adjusting to the absence of the weight. He pushed off the wall. He walked to the front of the room. He stood beside Grizzly, and he faced the chapter, and he said it. All of it. He said he had cut the cable. He said he had discouraged 2 previous mechanics. He said he had spent 17 years making sure this motorcycle stayed broken, because he believed it was a monument to the man who destroyed his brother. And destroying it was the only power he had over a situation that had taken everything from his family. He said it steadily, without excuses, and the room let him say it. Then he said, Caleb was innocent. I know that now. And Frank was the one person who knew it then and was trying to prove it. His voice went rough. I hated the wrong man. I spent 17 years hating the wrong man, and my brother spent the last years of his life without the one community that could have stood by him, and nothing I do will change that. He stopped. But I'm done letting it make me into something Caleb would have been ashamed of. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't a liar. He deserves better than a brother who spent 20 years doing damage in his name. The room was still. Then Grizzly said quietly, Sit down, Hawk. And Hawk sat. She turned to the motorcycle. The whole room turned with her. She didn't say anything. She just mounted the bike, swung her leg over it with the practiced ease of someone who had ridden since she was 16, and settled onto the seat, and felt the weight of the machine under her, the specific density and balance of it, the way a custom build sits differently than anything else, because every dimension of it was chosen deliberately, for a specific body, a specific rider. Her father had built this for himself. It fit her anyway. She didn't think about that too long. She looked down at the controls. She checked the fuel, the choke position, the kill switch. She put her hand on the throttle and felt the resistance of it. Then she pressed the starter. The engine turned over. It caught immediately. One compression cycle, the way a well-built engine should, and settled into a low idle. The sound of it filled the garage, filled the whole compound, the deep rhythmic pulse of a large V-twin that had been built with real craft and real care and had been waiting, literally waiting, for this moment. Everyone in the room held still. The seconds went by. 5. She heard someone near the back counting under their breath. 10. The engine held. Smooth, even, no variation in the idle, temperature gauge climbing slowly and steadily toward operating range the way it should. 15. Someone in the room inhaled audibly. 16. She kept her face perfectly neutral. She knew what had been causing the failure. She knew the valve was gone, and the housing was rebuilt, and the oil circuit was clean and complete. She knew the engine was going to keep running, but she also felt the weight of 17 seconds in a different way than she had expected to feel it. 17 years of this machine dying at this exact moment. 17 years of the scream and the heat and the shutdown. 17 years of people walking away, shaking their heads. 17. The engine kept running. 18. 19. 20. The room erupted. Not politely. Not carefully. The way rooms erupt when something that has been impossible for a very long time suddenly becomes real, with a force and a noise and a physical energy that comes from relief and shock and grief and joy, all arriving simultaneously and overwhelming the ability to sort them into appropriate forms of expression. Men who had not reacted outwardly to almost anything in the last 3 days were making noise. Grizzly had his eyes closed for a moment. Hawk, in the back, had his face turned away from the room. Haley opened the throttle. The engine answered. The V-twin went from its low, patient idle to a full, clean, thunderous roar. Not the scream of a machine tearing itself apart, but the roar of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do, delivering power without complaint, without drama, without the 17-year howl of something broken and unfinished. It was the most beautiful sound she had heard in her life. She didn't let herself acknowledge that fully in the moment. She sat on the motorcycle and felt it running beneath her, and let the sound fill the garage and let the room have its moment. Then she shut it off. The silence after was different from any silence before it. It had a weight to it, a fullness, the particular quality of a silence that exists because something large has just happened, and the air is still rearranging itself around the shape of it. She put the kickstand down and stepped off the bike. She walked to the workbench. She picked up the last item, the sealed envelope, her name on the front, in her father's handwriting. She held it up so the room could see it. Frank left a letter, she said, addressed to me. I'm keeping it. It's not chapter business, it's personal. She paused. But I want you to know it exists. Because Frank Dalton spent 17 years being the person who knew the truth while the truth was doing damage. And he deserves to be known as the man who tried to fix it, not just the man who didn't finish in time. The room was with her. She could feel it. Not as performance, not as strategy, but as something real, the particular quality of a group of people who had just had their understanding of a long, painful story fundamentally changed and were trying to find their footing in the new version. Grizzly stepped forward. He stood in front of the chapter and he said it simply. Caleb Brennan was innocent. This chapter owes him and his family an acknowledgement of that. We'll figure out how to do that, as a community, properly, not in the next 10 minutes. He looked at Hawk. And we'll figure out what accountability looks like for the interference with this repair. That's not tonight's conversation either. Tonight we acknowledge what Frank Dalton built, what he left, and what this woman found inside it. He turned to Haley. The reward, he said. It's yours, full amount, no conditions. She had thought about this too. I'll take enough to fix my truck and cover a month somewhere stable, she said. That's all I need. Grizzly started to say something. I didn't come here for the reward, she said. I came here because Earl told me there was a broken motorcycle. I fixed it because it was broken. What I found inside it... She stopped. That's a different matter. That's not something I get paid for. Grizzly looked at her for a long time. Then something happened on his face that she didn't quite have a name for. The expression of a man who had run a community for a long time and recognized, occasionally, the specific quality of a person worth keeping. There's a garage space, he said. Next building over. Been sitting empty for 2 years. We've been using it for storage. He paused. It could be a shop, real shop. If someone wanted to set up independently, not chapter business, their own business. The location's good. We got traffic, veterans, riders passing through, people who need work done and can't afford dealership rates. She looked at him. I'm not offering charity, he said quickly. I'm offering a location. You pay fair rent once you're on your feet. You run it your way. Nobody tells you what to take on and what to turn away. She held his gaze. I earn what I make, she said. That's the only way I'd want it, he said. She looked at the motorcycle. She looked at the papers on the workbench, at the hidden valve in its cloth wrapping, at the photograph of a man and a woman and a small blonde child who grew up not knowing who her father was and drove into the desert with nothing and found him inside a machine that no one else could fix. Okay, she said. One word. It was enough. From the back of the room, someone started it. A slow, rhythmic knock on a metal surface, the sound of a room beginning to recognize something real, and then others joined it until the garage was full of it. And it wasn't applause exactly. It was something older and more deliberate than applause. Haley Monroe stood in the middle of it, grease still on her knuckles, her father's letter in her jacket pocket. The motorcycle that had waited 17 years running perfectly in her memory. She didn't smile. Not yet. There was still too much to do. But she breathed. And for the first time since she'd pulled off the highway in Kingman with a cracked windshield and a bungee cord tailgate, she felt the particular sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anyone had told her so, and not because the story demanded it, but because her hands had brought her here, and her hands had never yet led her entirely wrong. Outside, the desert morning was beginning, and the motorcycle was alive. The chapter didn't disperse right away. That surprised her. She had expected the room to break up quickly after the engine ran. People processing in their own space, conversations forming in smaller groups, the natural dispersal of a crowd after a shared event. Instead, they stayed. Not in any organized way, not because anyone told them to, but the way people stay when something has happened that they don't yet have the language for, and leaving feels wrong before they find it. She used that time. While Grizzly held quiet conversations near the front, and the room gradually found its own rhythm, Haley sat at the workbench and organized Frank's documents into two distinct groups. The first group was the financial records, everything that documented the theft, the shell accounts, the fabricated invoices, the evidence that would allow someone with the right expertise to follow the money to its source. The second group was the personal material, the photographs, the handwritten notes that weren't about the theft, the small human evidence of a life that had existed alongside the mechanics and the ledgers. She kept the letter. She kept the photograph of her mother. Everything else she put in order for Grizzly. A man she didn't know came and stood beside her at the workbench. He was older, mid-60s, she guessed, with the kind of weathered, careful face that belonged to someone who had seen a great deal and learned to measure his reactions. He looked at the documents without touching them. I was here when they pushed Caleb out, he said. She looked at him. I voted to push him out, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not saying it to confess and feel better about myself. I'm saying it because you're Frank's daughter, and Frank knew me, and I think he would want someone to say it to your face rather than whisper it in a corner somewhere. She waited. He kept saying he didn't do it, the man said. Right to the end. He wasn't angry about it. That was the part I couldn't understand at the time. He was more devastated, like a man who'd had the ground pulled out and couldn't understand why. He paused. That's what innocent people look like, I've come to understand. Angry people look guilty because anger looks like something to hide. Devastated people look innocent because they genuinely cannot comprehend what's happening to them. He looked at her. I understood that too late to matter. What's your name? She said. Ray. Ray, she said. Frank was still gathering the proof when he died. He didn't have time to clear Caleb's name before it was too late. But he built this entire machine around making sure the truth survived him. He didn't stop trying. She picked up the hidden valve in its cloth wrapping and held it out to Ray. He built a lock. He put the evidence inside and built a lock around it that only someone who thought exactly like him would ever find. She paused. He didn't give up on Caleb. He just ran out of time. Ray took the valve carefully. He looked at it for a long moment. You found it, he said. I found it. Nobody else could. Nobody else looked at it from the right direction, she said. That's not about skill. That's about approach. The previous mechanics all started the engine first. I didn't. Ray handed the valve back. Frank would have done the same thing. he said quietly. Exactly the same. He looked at the motorcycle. He used to say that the answer to a mechanical problem was always in the question you chose to ask. Most people ask what's broken. He always asked why. She absorbed that. Why had been her question from the beginning. Not what's wrong with this engine, but why would a builder like Frank Dalton produce a motorcycle with this specific failure? She hadn't known she was thinking like her father. She hadn't known she had anything to inherit from him. Now she understood that she'd been carrying it her entire life without knowing what it was. Ray left without saying anything else, and she was glad for that. She needed the silence to hold what he'd just given her without dropping any of it. Grizzly came to the workbench 20 minutes later, when the room had thinned to half its original number. "I need to ask you something," he said. "And I need you to answer me directly." "All right," she said. "Hawk, what do you want to happen to him?" She had been expecting this question. She had been building her answer since the moment she'd watched Hawk walk out of the garage to find Grizzly and say what he'd done. "He spent 17 years in grief," she said. "He built the grief into a wall, and then used the wall as a weapon. That's a specific kind of damage, not evil, not calculated, just a person who needed someone to blame and found someone to blame and eventually couldn't tell the difference between the blame and the truth." She paused. "He's not the first person that's happened to. He won't be the last." "That doesn't answer my question," Grizzly said. "I know." She turned to face him directly. "I don't want him expelled. I don't want him destroyed. I want him to face what he did. In front of this chapter, clearly, with real consequences attached. And then I want him to have somewhere to go from there that isn't just shame." She paused. "Shame without a path forward is just more wall building. It doesn't fix anything." Grizzly studied her. "He interfered with 2 previous mechanics," he said. "He discouraged them before they got started. He cut your cable while you were working." "Yes. He could have hurt you." "He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to prevent an outcome. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at Grizzly steadily. "Grizzly, Caleb Brennan died without his community. He died without the people who should have stood by him, because a complicated truth got simplified into an accusation, and nobody waited for the full story. I'm not going to be the reason Hawk loses everything, because I wanted to feel like justice happened." She paused. "Real justice is Caleb's name being cleared. Everything else is accounting." Grizzly was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He'll be suspended from leadership, formally, in front of the chapter. He'll give an accounting of what he did and why. And he'll spend however long it takes earning back what he damaged." He paused. "That's my decision as the person who runs this community. I wanted to know if it conflicted with what you needed." "It doesn't," she said. "Good." He picked up the financial records from her organized stack. "I'm going to have someone follow up on the accounting trail. We have people who know how to do that." His voice hardened slightly. "Whoever actually took that money, that's a different conversation than Hawk. That person isn't getting a path forward. That person is getting found." "Good," she said. He started to walk away, and then stopped, and turned back, and she could see he was carrying something he hadn't said yet. "Frank talked about his daughter," he said. "I told you that this morning. What I didn't tell you is that the last time he mentioned her, it was maybe 2 weeks before he died. He said he'd found a lead. He thought he was close to locating her." His voice was quiet. "He died before he could follow it. We didn't know what lead he was talking about. We didn't know who he was looking for." He paused. "It was you." She felt that land in her chest. 2 weeks. Her father had been 2 weeks from finding her. She kept her face still. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded and walked away, and she turned to the workbench and put her hands flat on it and stared at the surface for exactly as long as she needed to before she could move again. 2 weeks. The distance between the life she'd lived and the life that had almost found her. She breathed. She picked up her tools. There was still work to do. The other garage, the empty one Grizzly had offered, needed to be assessed. She'd agreed to the arrangement without looking at the space, which in hindsight was exactly the kind of decision that resulted in expensive surprises. She needed to know what she was actually working with before she built any plans around it. She excused herself from what remained of the gathering and went to look. The space was larger than she'd expected. Much larger. 2 full bays, a third that had been partially converted to storage and could be converted back. There was a built-in workbench along one wall. Old, solid, the kind of workbench that had been bolted in by someone who understood what real work looked like. The electrical needed updating. The floor drain was probably clogged. The overhead lights were a mix of functional and not. But the bones were good. She walked the whole space slowly, the way she'd walked around the motorcycle for the first time, not rushing to conclusions, not projecting what she wanted it to be over what it actually was. She measured with her eye and her pace. She thought about flow, where a bike would come in, where it would be worked, where parts would be staged, where a customer might wait. She thought about what Earl had said when she'd stopped at his garage on the way into Kingman. He didn't have enough work for another person. He'd pointed her here almost as an afterthought. She thought about all the roadside jobs she'd done. People calling from highway shoulders with broken-down vehicles and no money and nowhere to go. And her showing up because she needed the work, and because something in her couldn't leave a broken thing unattended. She thought about the apprenticeship program she'd been running in her head since she was 19. Not formally, not in any way she'd written down or told anyone about. But the shape of it had always been there. The idea that the skills she'd had to teach herself, because no one offered to teach her, could be structured, offered, made accessible to the specific kind of young person who fell through cracks and needed something real to hold on to. She'd been one of those people. She knew what it felt like to reach for something and find nothing there. She stood in the middle of the empty garage and thought about what this space could be. Not what it was, what it could be. She was still standing there, turning slowly, measuring with her eyes, when Hawk appeared in the doorway. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him. He looked worse than he had this morning, and this morning he had looked like a man who hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were red-rimmed, but dry. He had the particular flatness of expression that came from crying that was finished, not suppressed, but spent, the face of someone who had gone through something and come out the other side into the strange, quiet territory beyond it. He stayed in the doorway. "Grizzly told me what you said," he said, "about what you wanted. The suspension, not—" He stopped. "Not the other thing." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She considered the question seriously, the way he'd asked it seriously. "Because expelling you doesn't clear Caleb's name," she said. "It just gives the chapter something to do with its guilt. It's easier to expel someone than to sit with the fact that a whole community got it wrong and an innocent man paid for it." She paused. "I didn't come here to make anything easier." Hawk came inside. Not all the way, just far enough that he wasn't in the doorway anymore. He looked at the empty bays. "This going to be your shop?" he said. "If it works out." "It'll work out," he said. It came out flat, factual, like someone stating something they knew for certain. "You fix the unfixable thing. Word travels in this community. You'll have more work than you can handle inside 3 months." She looked at him. "Your brother," she said. "What was he good at?" Hawk blinked. The question had clearly not been what he expected. "Caleb?" He thought for a moment. He was good with numbers. He was the one who managed the fund accounts. That's how his credentials were on the authorization forms. He understood financial systems the way you understand engines. A pause. He was patient. He'd sit with a problem for hours. He hated shortcuts. She nodded slowly. "There's an apprenticeship program I want to run," she said. "Out of this garage, for young adults who've aged out of foster care or don't have a stable place to start from. They learn the work. They earn while they learn. They build something real." She looked at Hawk. "I want to name a tool fund after Caleb, for apprentices who can't afford their own equipment." Hawk was completely still. "The Caleb Brennan Tool Fund," she said. "So his name is attached to something that helps people instead of attached to something that destroyed him." She watched Hawk's face go through several things in rapid succession. She didn't try to read all of them. She just gave him time. He finally said, "He would have liked that." "I thought he might," she said. Another silence. This one was different from the silences earlier in the day. Not the silence of a confrontation finding its shape, but the silence of two people standing in an empty space, figuring out what it might hold. "I'll support it," Hawk said. "Whatever that means practically, financially, helping recruit, whatever you need, I'll be there." He paused. "Not to make myself feel better. I know that's not how it works." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But I can't just sit with what I did and do nothing with it," he said. "Caleb wouldn't have wanted that either. He wasn't that kind of person." "No," she said. "I don't think he was." She turned and walked to the built-in workbench and ran her hand along the surface. Solid oak under years of grime and paint. Good bones. Everything in here had good bones. "Pain explains what you did," she said. "It doesn't erase it." "I know, but it also doesn't have to define everything that comes after it." She turned to look at him. "That's the part that's up to you now." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once. The same slow, deliberate nod she'd seen from him in the garage when she'd given him the chance to go to Grizzly himself. The nod of a man who understood exactly what he was agreeing to. He left. She stood in the empty garage alone and thought about a word her mother used to use. A word she'd forgotten for years, and then suddenly remembered one night on the side of a highway, sitting beside a broken-down truck, waiting for a part that was taking too long to arrive. Her mother had used the word redemption. Not in a religious way. Her mother hadn't been a particularly religious woman, but in the mechanical sense of it. The idea that something broken could be brought back. That the brokenness wasn't the final state. That patience and the right hands could restore the function that had been lost. Her mother had said it about engines. Haley had learned it from engines. And now she was standing in an empty garage in Kingman, Arizona, watching it apply to people too. She went back to the main garage to collect her tools. Frank's motorcycle sat where she'd left it. The rest of the chapter had cleared out now, and the garage was quiet in the specific way of garages after major work. The particular settled quiet of a space that has held something difficult and come through it. She stood and looked at the motorcycle for a long time. She thought about the letter. She hadn't read it again since the first time, in the early hours of the morning. She'd carried it in her jacket pocket through everything that followed. The confrontation with Hawk, the assembly of the chapter, the engine start, all of it. And it had been there against her ribs the whole time, light and heavy at once. She took it out now. She sat on the upturned crate, the same one she'd sat on when Hawk had walked in and found her with the papers. And she read it again. More slowly this time. With the distance of a day that had changed everything. Some things she'd missed the first time because she'd been too raw to absorb them. He wrote about craft. He wrote about the specific satisfaction of working with your hands on a real problem. Not a conceptual problem. Not a problem on paper. But a physical thing that either worked or didn't, and told you honestly whether you'd gotten it right. He wrote that it was the most honest feedback he'd ever found in his life, and that he'd spent years looking for its equivalent in relationships and never quite succeeded, and that his inability to find it there had contributed to his failure as a father and a partner in ways he'd taken too long to understand. He wrote, "The machine doesn't lie to you. It doesn't tell you you're doing fine when you're not. It doesn't let you get away with almost right." I loved that about it, and I also let it make me impatient with people who are always only almost right and always need more time than the work requires. I should have given your mother more time. I should have given myself more time. I didn't know that then. She read that section twice. Then she read, "If you're anything like me, and the fact that you found this suggests you might be, you already know the satisfaction I'm talking about. You already know what it feels like when the engine turns over right after you've been fighting it for hours. If you know that feeling, then you know the most important thing I ever understood. And that means something got through, even without me there to give it. That's not enough. But it's something." She folded the letter. She sat with it for a moment. Then she made a decision she'd been considering since the early hours of the morning, since she'd first understood who Frank Dalton was and what he'd left inside the machine. She was going to find out who actually stole the money. Not because Grizzly couldn't follow the financial trail. He'd said he had people for that, and she believed him. But because Frank had spent the last 2 years of his life building the case, and Frank's daughter had found the case, and it felt incomplete to hand the evidence to Grizzly and walk away from the result. She didn't need to be in the room when the accountability happened. She didn't need credit for following it. She just needed to know the story had an ending. She went looking for Ray. She found him outside, sitting alone in the thin afternoon shade with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand. "Frank's accounting records," she said, sitting down beside him without preamble. He traced the money to an outside accountant, someone who had access to the fund management system. "Is that a small enough pool of people that it's identifiable?" Ray set down his coffee. At the time, the fund was managed through a local accounting firm, small one. Frank helped set it up. He insisted on outside management because he didn't want chapter members handling chapter charity money without oversight. He paused. The irony. How many people at that firm had access? Maybe 3 or 4. Principal, 2 associates, an office manager. He thought. The principal retired. I don't know about the others. Do you remember the firm's name? He told her. She wrote it in her notebook. Frank's records trace the shell accounts to a specific routing structure, she said. If someone who understands forensic accounting compares that structure to the actual transaction records from that firm's operating accounts, the connection should be traceable. She paused. It won't be fast, but it's followable. Ray looked at her with an expression that was part surprise and part recognition. You sound like Frank, he said. He used to explain mechanical problems the same way, step by step, no drama, just the logic. I know, she said. People have been telling me that all day. She stood. Give that information to Grizzly, she said. Tell him I said the trail is specific enough to pursue, and the documentation is complete enough to support a formal complaint if they find what I think they'll find. Ray nodded. And Ray, she said. He looked up. When Caleb's name gets officially cleared, and it will, I want there to be a record of what this chapter did to correct the mistake. Not hidden, not handled quietly. A real record, in whatever form is appropriate, that says Caleb Brennan was a member of this community in good standing, that he was wrongly accused, and that the community acknowledges it. She paused. That's not punishment. That's just the truth getting its proper place in the record. Yes, Ray said, simply, without qualification. Yes, that's right. She left him there and went back to the garage. She spent the next 2 hours cleaning and organizing. Not Frank's garage, but the adjacent one that was going to be hers. She worked systematically, moving stored materials to one corner, sweeping, testing electrical outlets, running water through the floor drain until it cleared. She was not going to wait for conditions to be perfect before she started. She had learned a long time ago that perfect conditions were a story people told themselves to avoid beginning. She was on her knees working on the drain when she heard footsteps and looked up to find a young man standing in the doorway. He looked about 17, with the specific kind of watchful stillness that she recognized from her own younger years, the look of someone who had learned to read rooms carefully before committing to being in them. Someone said you're setting up a shop, he said. Working on it, she said, without stopping what she was doing. You need help cleaning out? She sat back and looked at him. You know anything about motorcycles? Not much, he said honestly. You willing to learn? He thought about it for a moment, seriously, not reflexively. Yes, he said. What's your name? Marco. Marco, she said. Grab that broom in the corner and start on the far bay. We'll talk about the rest when it's clean enough to think in here. He got the broom without another word, and she heard him start sweeping in the other bay, and something about the sound of it, the practical, unhurried sound of work beginning, settled something in her chest that had been unsettled for a very long time. She went back to the drain. By early evening, the garage was functional enough that she could see what it was going to be. Not finished. Nowhere close to finished. But the shape of it was visible now. The potential of it. The specific way the space could be organized to serve the work she intended to do. Marco had been steady the whole time. He asked questions when he needed to ask them and worked without supervision when he didn't. He had a natural spatial intelligence. He understood almost intuitively how things should be arranged for efficiency, moving items to logical positions before she'd told him where she wanted them, and being right most of the time. She made a note of that. Grizzly found her at 7 in the evening, when the light was going horizontal and gold and the compound had settled into its early evening rhythm. He was carrying something, a set of keys on a plain ring. He held them out. "Garage keys," he said. "Front door and the side bay door." She took them. The weight of them in her palm was ordinary. Just keys, just metal. But she felt the weight of something else attached to them that she didn't have a precise word for. "First month's rent is waived," he said. "Call it back pay on the reward you wouldn't take." She started to object. "Don't," he said, not unkindly. "You earned it. And Frank would have wanted you to have a running start." She closed her hand around the keys. "There's one more thing," Grizzly said. He reached into his jacket and brought out a small envelope, separate from everything else. This was in Frank's personal effects. We kept it with the chapter records because we didn't know what it was or who it was for. He held it out. "It's addressed to the same person as the letter you found. Just says Haley. Small envelope. We figured it was something personal and held on to it thinking someday we'd understand who Haley was." She took the envelope. She didn't open it immediately. She held it and looked at Grizzly. "Someday," she said. "Someday," he agreed. He left, and she stood alone in her garage. Her garage, those two words were going to take a while to feel real. And she opened the small envelope. Inside was a single index card. On it, in the same careful handwriting as the letter, was a brief note. "If you're reading this, and you're who I think you are, then you found the valve, and you fixed the engine, and you think the way I think. That means you already understand the most important part. The machine will always tell you the truth if you're willing to listen. People are harder, but they work on the same principle. Be patient with them the way you're patient with the work. It's worth it. I promise it's worth it. FD." She read it twice. Then she put it in her shirt pocket, next to the photograph of her mother. She walked to the doorway of the garage and stood there, looking out at the compound in the evening light. She could see Frank's motorcycle through the window of the main garage, still on its kickstand, the chrome catching the last horizontal light of the day. It had waited 17 years. It had screamed and died and been covered and uncovered and examined and failed and been covered again. And it had waited, because Frank Dalton had built a machine that was patient enough to hold the truth until the right person came along to hear it. And the right person had come along. Driving a cracked windshield and a bungee cord tailgate with $200 and a toolbox and no plan beyond survive. She turned back to her garage. Marco was still there, stacking the last of the displaced materials into the corner she'd indicated. "That's good," she said. "That's enough for tonight." He set down what he was holding and looked at her. "Same time tomorrow?" he said. She looked at him. 7 a.m., she said. "Bring work clothes. We're going to start learning engines." He nodded, and for the first time since he'd appeared in the doorway with that careful, room-reading stillness, he let something else onto his face. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. She watched him leave. Then she turned off the garage light, pulled the door shut, and locked it with her new keys. She stood outside with the keys in her hand and the compound going quiet around her, and the desert evening settling in with its particular kind of silence. Not empty, but full of the specific sound of everything that was done and everything that was still to come. She put the keys in her pocket. She went to find something to eat. Tomorrow was going to start early, and there was a great deal of work left to do. There always was. That was the part she had always loved most. Marco showed up at 6:53 the next morning. 7 minutes early, work clothes, a cheap notebook. He'd clearly bought the night before, because the spine was uncracked. He stood outside the garage door waiting without knocking, which told her something about how he'd been raised. Not to assume, not to push, to wait for permission before entering spaces that weren't clearly his yet. She unlocked the door and handed him a rag and pointed at the workbench. "Clean it," she said. "Every surface. I want to be able to eat off it before we put a single tool down." He got to work without asking why. That was the second thing she noted about Marco. Some people needed the reason before they could do the task. Marco understood that the task was the reason. In a garage, that distinction mattered enormously. She spent the first hour beside him, cleaning her half of the workbench while he cleaned his, and she talked while they worked. Not a lecture. She had always hated lectures, had always learned better from someone who talked sideways at a problem while their hands were doing something else. She talked about the workbench itself, about why the surface needed to be clean and flat and known before any work began, about how the first mistake most amateur mechanics made was starting on an unknown surface, and how that single variable, what is actually under my tools right now, contaminated every diagnosis that followed. The first job, she said, is always to understand what you're actually working with, not what you think you're working with, not what someone told you you're working with. What the thing actually is, right now, in front of you. Marco was quiet for a moment. "Is that how you found the problem with the other bike?" he said. "The one everyone said was cursed?" She glanced at him. "Who told you about that?" "Everyone," he said simply. "The whole compound talked about nothing else last night." She went back to cleaning. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly how." He nodded slowly, processing it, and she could see the gears of it working in him. Not just the mechanical principle, but the larger idea underneath it. The idea that the first and most important discipline was seeing clearly, without the interference of assumption or expectation, or the accumulated weight of what everyone before you had already decided. She recognized the look on his face. She had worn that same look at 16, in a garage not unlike this one, when a much older mechanic had said something offhand that reorganized the way she thought about every problem she would ever face. She kept talking. By 9 o'clock, Grizzly knocked on the open doorway and told her she had a customer. Her first customer was a veteran named Dennis, who rode an older Sportster and had been nursing a persistent oil leak that 2 other shops had told him would require a complete engine rebuild. The estimate he'd been given was more than the motorcycle was worth, and he'd been riding with it leaking for 3 months because he couldn't afford the rebuild and couldn't afford not to ride. Howe was in his late 50s, quiet, with the particular economy of movement and expression that she associated with people who had learned not to waste either. He explained the problem with precise, minimal words, and she listened without interrupting. And when he was done, she asked him 2 questions. Where exactly the leak appeared and when it was worst. And then she asked him to start the engine. She watched for 4 minutes. Then she told him to shut it off. "Rocker box gasket," she said. "Left side. It's a 2-hour job, not a rebuild." Dennis stared at her. 2 other mechanics said rebuild, he said. 2 other mechanics didn't watch it warm up long enough to see where the oil was actually coming from, she said. "It's tracking down the outside of the case from the rocker box and pooling at the bottom. From the bottom, it looks like a case issue. It's not." He was quiet for a moment. "How much?" he said. She told him. He looked like a man who was waiting for the number to change, or for a catch, or for the other shoe. When neither appeared, he sat down on a crate and rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been riding with that leak for 3 months, he said. "I was starting to think I was going to have to sell the bike." "You're not selling the bike," she said. "Come back Thursday. I'll have the gasket here by Wednesday." He came back Thursday. The job took her an hour and 40 minutes. He stood in the doorway and watched the whole time, not intrusively, but with the attention of a man who needed to understand the work being done on something he trusted his life to. She talked him through every step, not because he asked her to, but because she understood that kind of watching. When it was done, he started the motorcycle, and they both looked at the engine running clean, no oil moving where it shouldn't. He looked at her. "I'm going to tell everyone I know," he said. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He wasn't exaggerating. Within 2 weeks, she had more work than she could handle alone, which meant Marco's education accelerated out of necessity. She couldn't spend 40 minutes explaining the principle behind every task anymore. She had to explain it in 8 minutes while they both kept working. He adapted. He was fast, which she'd expected, and he was careful, which she'd hoped for but hadn't assumed. Careful was harder than fast. Fast came from youth and energy. Careful came from understanding that a mistake in a garage could cost someone their life on a highway, and that understanding had to be earned, not told. She told him that on his third week. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Is that why you wouldn't start the cursed bike right away?" he said. "Because you were being careful?" "I was being careful," she said. "And I was being honest. There's a difference between careful and slow. Slow is when you don't trust yourself. Careful is when you trust yourself enough to know what you don't know yet." He wrote that in his notebook. She saw him do it and said nothing. But she felt something. Not pride exactly, but the specific satisfaction of watching something take root that was worth the ground it was planted in. The sign went up on a Thursday morning, 5 weeks after she'd first pulled into the compound with a cracked windshield and $200. She painted it herself on a piece of salvaged wood. Black letters, no flourishes. Monroe Motor Works. Marco held the ladder while she bolted it to the outside wall. When it was up, he stepped back and looked at it. "Monroe," he said. "That's your name." "Yes," she said. "Not Dalton." She looked at him. He was smart enough to understand the significance of that without her spelling it out, and she could see him turning it over. The choice to put her own name on the building, not her father's, the deliberate claim of something earned rather than inherited. "Your name," he said. It wasn't a question anymore, it was recognition. "My name," she said. She climbed down from the ladder and looked at the sign herself, and for a moment she let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the sign. The sign was just paint on wood. The weight of the 5 weeks it had taken to get here, and the 24 years before those 5 weeks, and the fact that somewhere in the frame of the motorcycle in the garage 20 feet away, her father had hidden a letter that ended with words she was only now beginning to fully understand. "Be patient with them, the way you're patient with the work. It's worth it. I promise it's worth it." She picked up the ladder. "Come on," she said. "We've got a transmission waiting." 3 weeks after the sign went up, the first apprentice arrived. Her name was Destiny. She was 19, had aged out of the foster system 8 months earlier, and had been living in a one-room situation that she described with careful understatement as not ideal. She'd heard about the shop through a veterans outreach worker who'd heard about it from Dennis, who apparently had indeed told everyone he knew. She stood in the doorway exactly the way Marco had stood in the doorway on his first morning. That same careful, room-reading stillness. The same watchfulness that came from years of reading environments before committing to them. Haley recognized it immediately. She had been that person. "Come in," she said. "You don't have to stand in the doorway." Destiny came in. She looked at the workbench. She looked at Marco, who was elbow-deep in a carburetor and nodded at her without stopping work. She looked at the tools arranged in their specific, logical order along the bench. "I don't know anything about motorcycles," she said. "Marco didn't either," Haley said. "He's pretty good now," Destiny said, watching him work. 8 weeks, Haley said. "That's all it takes if you're willing to actually learn." Destiny looked at her directly. "What do you need from me?" she said. Haley looked at her for a moment. That was a good question. Not what do I get, not what are the conditions, but what do you need? The question of someone who understood that real opportunity required something in return. "I need you here at 7, she said. "I need you to ask questions when you don't understand something, and I need you to tell me the truth when you make a mistake, instead of hoping I won't notice. I'll notice. What I can't fix is a lie." Destiny nodded. "When do I start?" "You already did," Haley said. "Go stand next to Marco and watch what he's doing. Ask him to explain it." That was how it began. By the end of 3 months, Monroe Motor Works had 4 apprentices, a 6-week waiting list, and a reputation that had spread well beyond the immediate community. Through the veteran networks Dennis had access to, through rider forums, through the specific underground current by which people who need things found and find the people who can provide them. Haley worked 14-hour days and didn't apologize for it, because she had been working 14-hour days since she was 17, and she had finally found a version of it that meant something beyond survival. She also started the Caleb Brennan Tool Fund. She did it formally, set up a small bank account, wrote a one-page description of what the fund was for, posted it on the shop's wall. The description included Caleb's name, a brief account of what had happened to him, and the truth that had eventually cleared him, and the specific purpose of the fund, providing tools for apprentices who couldn't afford their own equipment. Hawk came in the day she posted it. He stood in front of it for a long time. She was working on a bike in the far bay, and she watched him from a distance, not interrupting. She could see the full weight of the moment on him, the specific way a person stands when they're reading something about someone they loved, the stillness that was different from any other kind of stillness. He turned around. His eyes were dry. He'd done his crying. What was left was something more durable than grief, the particular hardened quality of a person who had been through the worst thing and come out the other side, carrying the memory of it as a permanent part of themselves, rather than as something that would eventually lighten. "He deserved better than what we gave him," Hawk said. "Yes," she said simply. "This is better," he said. "It's a start," she said. He reached into his jacket and took out an envelope. He set it on the workbench without ceremony. "First donation," he said. "The fund is named for my brother. It should start from his family." She didn't open the envelope. She didn't ask how much. She just looked at him and said, "Thank you." He nodded. He looked once more at the posting on the wall, and then he left. She opened the envelope after he was gone. It was more money than she'd expected. More than she'd expected by a significant amount. She sat with it for a moment. Then she added it to the fund account and went back to work. The news about the accountant came from Grizzly 6 weeks later. He called her into his office. An unusual thing, he had not called her into his office before, and sat across from her at a plain table and told her what his people had found. The financial trail from Frank's records had led to a former associate at the accounting firm. A man who had left the firm a year after the charity fund scandal, relocated twice, and built a quiet life in another state. He was 71 years old now. He had a family. He had grandchildren. He also had a documented trail of financial manipulation that Grizzly's people, working with a forensic accountant they'd hired privately, had assembled into a complete, unambiguous picture. "We have everything Frank was trying to put together," Grizzly said. "His records plus what we've added. It's enough." "What are you going to do with it?" she said. Grizzly folded his hands on the table. "The families who lost money from that fund. Some of them are still around. The ones we can find, we're going to repay. Every dollar, with interest, from chapter funds. That happens first." He paused. "Then the documentation goes to the appropriate authorities. What happens after that is out of our hands. But the documentation is complete, and it's going in." She nodded. "Caleb's name," she said. "Formally cleared," Grizzly said. "In writing, on chapter record, with a full account of what happened and what the truth was. That's already done." He opened a folder and slid a document across the table to her. "I thought you should have a copy." She looked at the document. It was a formal chapter record. Actual letterhead, formal language, the specific gravity of a community, putting something on record that it intended to stand. It named Caleb Brennan. It stated clearly that he had been wrongly accused. It stated clearly that the evidence Frank Dalton had gathered, preserved, and ultimately transmitted through the construction of a motorcycle had exonerated him completely. It was signed by Grizzly and witnessed by Ray and 2 other senior members. She read it all the way through. "Frank spent the last 2 years of his life trying to get to this document," she said. "He did," Grizzly said. "He got here," she said. "Just not the way he expected to." Grizzly looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of deep feeling. Not demonstrative, not verbose, but present in a way that was unmistakable. "No," he said quietly. "Not the way he expected to." She folded the document carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, with the letter and the index card and the photograph of her mother, the collection of things she had accumulated that would never go in a box and never go in a drawer and never be anywhere other than close to her for the rest of her life. She stood to leave. "One more thing," Grizzly said. She turned. He stood up, and he walked to the small cabinet behind his desk, and he opened it, and he brought out something she hadn't expected to see in his office. It was a framed photograph, not the one she had found in the frame tube. She still had that. This was a different one, larger, a group shot from what looked like a chapter event from many years ago. She recognized Frank in it immediately. She'd been studying his face long enough now that she could pick it out anywhere. He was younger in this photograph, mid-30s maybe, and he was grinning with the unguarded ease of a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. "We had this in storage," Grizzly said, "with the old chapter records. I found it when we were pulling Frank's documents." He held it out to her. "You should have this." She took it. She looked at her father's face for a moment. She thought about a man who built things with his hands, who understood that machines told the truth when people couldn't or wouldn't, who built a lock around the most important thing he ever discovered, because he understood that truth needed to be protected until the right moment, and then released completely, without reservation. She thought about what Ray had said, the first morning, that Frank always asked why instead of what. She had been asking why her entire life. She had just never known where she got it from. "Thank you," she said. She took the photograph back to her garage and hung it on the wall above the workbench, where she could see it from anywhere in the space. The anniversary ride was announced 3 weeks before it happened. It was an annual tradition. The chapter rode together on the same day every year, a long route through the desert that began before sunrise and ended somewhere in the afternoon. It was the kind of event that accumulated meaning over years, that members looked forward to in a specific way, that carried the weight of everyone who had ridden it before. This year, for the first time in 17 years, Frank Dalton's motorcycle was going to ride with them. Haley heard about it from Marco, who had heard about it from someone in the chapter, and she didn't react immediately because she was in the middle of a fuel system diagnostic and the motorcycle required her complete attention. But after Marco left for the evening and she was locking up alone, she thought about it. She hadn't ridden this motorcycle since the morning she'd started the engine in front of the chapter. She hadn't avoided it deliberately. She'd simply had other things to do, and the motorcycle had been moved to a place of prominence in the main garage, and it had not been her place to casually throw a leg over it. But she thought about it now. She thought about what Grizzly would say, what the ride would mean, what it would mean for her to be part of it. Not as Frank's daughter, which was true and permanent and unchangeable, but as the mechanic who had understood what Frank built, which was what she had earned. She thought about her father building this machine through 8 years of careful, patient work, gathering custom components from riders across several states, assembling something that was supposed to represent the best of what a community could be, building it with the knowledge that he might never ride it, finishing it knowing the truth he had to hide inside it, knowing that the hiding meant the machine could never be ridden until the truth came out. He had given up the ride so the truth could survive. She thought about that for a long time. 3 days before the anniversary, Grizzly found her at the shop. He came in without ceremony, looked at what she was working on, a transmission teardown, Destiny on one side and Marco on the other, both of them learning to see what a transmission's internal wear patterns could tell you about how a bike had been ridden, and waited until she was at a stopping point. She looked up. He held out the keys to Frank's motorcycle. Not her garage keys, the other ones. The ones she'd seen him hold the morning after the engine ran, the keys to the machine itself. "Ride it Saturday," he said. She looked at the keys. "It's chapter property," she said. "It belongs to whoever earned the right to ride it," he said. "That's you." "I'm not a member of this chapter," she said. "No," he said. "But Frank was, and Frank built it, and Frank's daughter fixed it." He held the keys steady. "It was waiting for you. We both know that." She thought about all the ways she could deflect this, all the reasonable, practical, appropriately modest reasons to say no. She'd been generating those kinds of responses her entire life, the reflexive machinery of someone who had learned not to expect things to be given, who had learned to distrust gifts because gifts usually came with costs that were revealed later. But these keys weren't a gift. She had paid for these keys. with 36 hours of work, with the willingness to look at a broken thing without flinching, with the choice to tell the truth in a room full of people who might not have wanted to hear it. With the 24 years before that, learning to be a mechanic because no one was going to do it for her, because the world was full of broken things and someone had to be able to fix them. She reached out and took the keys. The morning of the anniversary ride, she was at the main garage by 4:30. She spent an hour going over the motorcycle completely. Not because she didn't trust her own work, but because a machine that was going to carry a person on a desert highway at speed deserved to be checked before it did it, every time, without exception. She checked every system. She checked the tire pressure, the brake lines, the chain tension, the fluid levels. She started it cold and listened to it warm up, reading the idle the way she read everything, looking for what was actually there, not what she expected. The engine sounded perfect. She let it run for 20 minutes and then shut it down and made 2 small adjustments, one to the idle mixture, one to the throttle cable tension, that she'd noticed during the warm-up. Not because anything was wrong. Because she knew this engine now, the way she knew engines she'd spent real time with, and she could hear the small deviations from ideal that were invisible to anyone who hadn't listened as carefully. When she was done with the adjustments, she started it again. It was perfect. Marco arrived at 5:15, which was early for him. He wasn't riding the anniversary route. He wasn't old enough and wasn't in the chapter. But he'd come anyway, because he understood without being told that this was a significant day and that being present for it mattered. He stood inside the garage door and watched her make her final checks. "How do you know when it's ready?" he said. "When I can't find anything else to look at," she said. "And when everything I looked at was actually fine, not just fine because I stopped looking." He wrote it in his notebook. She looked at him. "Marco," she said. He looked up. "You've been here 11 weeks, she said. "I want you to know something." She paused, choosing the words. "You started with nothing. No background, no training, no connection to any of this. You showed up and you worked and you asked the right questions and you didn't pretend to know things you didn't know." She paused again. "That combination is rarer than talent. Don't let anyone tell you that coming from nothing is a disadvantage in this work. The people who come from nothing and still show up, those are the ones who actually know what they're doing." Marco was quiet for a moment. "Frank Dalton came from nothing?" he said. "I don't know his whole story," she said. "But I know he built something that lasted 17 years after he was gone, and still told the truth when the right person came along to hear it." She picked up the motorcycle keys. "That's not nothing, that's everything." The riders assembled at 6 o'clock. She had seen groups of motorcycles before. On highways, at rallies, the aggregated noise and presence of them. But she had never seen it from this angle, from inside it. Standing next to a motorcycle she had rebuilt, in a community she had come to through the most unlikely possible sequence of events, wearing her father's absence, like a scar she'd had so long, she'd stopped noticing it until the day it turned out to be something other than a wound. Grizzly moved through the assembling riders, speaking to people, organizing the order of the formation. He caught her eye and nodded once. She nodded back. Hawk was there. I wasn't in the front of the formation. He was somewhere in the middle, where a man who was in the process of earning back trust belonged. Not excluded, not restored to prominence, but present. Participating. Part of the thing. She had asked for that, and Grizzly had delivered it. And looking at Hawk now, she understood that it was the right outcome. Not comfortable, not easy, but right. He caught her looking. He held her gaze for a moment, and what passed between them was not forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness was going to take longer than 3 months, and she had decided not to rush it. But something in the same direction. The acknowledgement of a shared understanding about what had happened and what it meant. Ray was there. Dennis was there. A dozen other faces she had come to recognize over the past weeks of working in this compound. People who had become familiar through daily proximity and the small interactions of shared space. And 4 faces she recognized from Monroe Motor Works. Not apprentices, they weren't riders, but the apprentices' families. Destiny's older sister, who had driven down from Phoenix when she heard about the ride. Marco's mother, a small, compact woman who had come to the shop twice and watched her son work with an expression of bewildered pride that Haley had found genuinely moving. Two others connected in various ways to the people she was teaching. They hadn't been invited. They had just come. Because someone they cared about was doing something real, and real things attracted people. Grizzly came to stand beside her. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the motorcycle. She thought about Frank building it. She thought about the valve, and the hidden compartment, and the letter, and the photograph, and the 17-second scream. She thought about her mother, and about 2 weeks, and about a man who ran out of time but found a way to reach across it anyway through steel and oil and the specific language of mechanical precision. She put on her helmet. She swung her leg over the motorcycle. She felt it under her, the particular weight and balance of it, the specific geometry that her father had designed for his own body, and that fit her anyway, as if the dimensions of a good mechanic were more consistent than bloodlines. She put the key in. She looked down at the small engraving on the hidden valve casing, which she had remounted in a visible position after the repair. Not hidden anymore, not a lock anymore, just what it was. A record. A mark left by a craftsman who wanted to be understood. FD. Do not remove until the truth is found. The truth had been found. She pressed the starter. The engine caught immediately. One compression cycle, clean, confident. The sound of a machine that knew exactly what it was and what it was supposed to do. The deep, rhythmic pulse of the V-twin filled the compound and then spilled out past the gate and into the desert morning. The formation of riders responded to it. She could feel the change in the air, the way a sound that had been impossible for 17 years, suddenly being real again, reorganized something in the people who had been waiting for it, whether they'd known they were waiting or not. Grizzly moved to the head of the formation. He stopped. He stepped aside. He gestured to the space at the front. She understood. She looked at him for a moment. This man who had given a 24-year-old woman with a cracked windshield 48 hours to fix the impossible thing, who had listened when she told him the truth, even when the truth was expensive, who had stood in front of his chapter and let the full weight of a 17-year misunderstanding land without flinching from it. She rode to the front of the formation. She stopped. She felt the weight of the formation behind her, not pressing, not demanding, but present. All that history, all those miles and years and losses and recognitions and everything, a community accumulates when it stays together long enough to become real. The gates opened. The desert was beginning to lighten at the edges. Not sunrise yet. That was still 20 minutes out. But the sky beginning to shift from black to the deep blue that came just before the color arrived. The highway ahead was empty and long and perfectly straight, the way desert highways were, the kind of road that looked like it went on forever because in the relevant sense it did. She took a breath. She thought about her father, who had built this machine with his hands and never ridden it. She thought about her mother, who had raised her alone and given her a name, and died before Haley was old enough to ask the questions she needed to ask. She thought about the mechanic she had become, not because of anyone, not because someone handed her a path, but because she was the kind of person who could not leave a broken thing unattended, and the world was full of broken things, and that turned out to be enough of a foundation to build something real on. She opened the throttle. The motorcycle her father built moved forward onto the desert highway, the engine running clean and true and loud enough to mean something, and the formation followed, and the gates closed behind them, and the sun came over the horizon exactly on time. Haley Monroe rode at the front. Not because of whose daughter she was, because of whose hands she had, and what those hands had done, and what they were going to do next.